Welcome, everybody. So for tonight, we're going to go over designing micro lessons. Big thing before we're getting started is it really doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or if it's 8 hours. The process here that we're going to cover is the same. The biggest difference is going to be really honing in on that one or two things just because time is so condensed, but the process is going to look the same. So as we get going, I'll give you a quick overview of what to consider while we're planning and preparing, and then I'll give you an example 10-minute lesson related to focus. So let's get started. Okay, so as we get started, anytime we're developing content, whether it's for a lesson, a class, a course, doesn't matter, there's 4 concepts we really want to keep in mind to keep it simple for us. The first one is start at the end. What is the objective? Always begin your planning or your preparing with the objective in mind, especially from a learning perspective, something I can observe, which I'll talk more about coming up. But always have the objective in mind. The second one, let's not forget logistics and needs. Whether I'm doing something virtually or in person, there's just going to be certain things I have to make sure I'm aware of. How many people? Am I using technology? Do I even have access to technology if I want to use it? Those type of things. We just want to make sure we're not doing all this work and then we show up and we can't do what we want to do. So don't forget the logistics. But then once we have that, now we can go ahead and develop the plan. And the key thing here is developing the plan will always start with time. So in any 60-minute block of time, you're probably only going to have 1 or 2 primary exercises in general. However, as you're planning, think about the objective and what exercise can help you reach that objective. And when it comes to micro lessons, you're only going to get 1. So keep that in mind. So what's the objective? And what's a primary exercise that I can really knock out quickly within that 10-minute time frame? So then that way, when I'm evaluating the last piece here, how it went, it's really easy for me to assess, okay, did they learn? Did they execute what I wanted them to do so we can move forward? So those are the 4 components in relation to a micro lesson that I'll cover with you this evening. Okay, so getting started, identifying the objectives. So the big thing here, how many do we really need? On average, for any type of training lesson, we're probably not going to do more than 3. And you'll see a couple examples as I get to the bottom here. Because most of our trainings aren't exceeding an hour, especially with a micro lesson, you're probably going to have 1 or 2, which I'll show you when we get to the focus one. But no more than 3 to 5. Otherwise, it's just too much. And all of a sudden, your training gets complicated. And the most impactful training is simple and applicable. So that's why, on average, no more than 3. This is the big one, though. Keep learning in mind. Not all of us have an education background, and that's okay. But keep learning in mind because it's going to be easier for you to observe what you want to see happen. And so a question you can start asking yourself is, what do you want them to be doing with this knowledge? So if I'm teaching them about attention or imagery or whatever that is, what do they need to know and what do I want them to do with it? And so a lot of times we might have them identifying things first. Let's start defining things. There are going to be times where we're having them practice or apply some of these things. Maybe there's some times I just really want them to critically think and I'm just having them evaluate. Maybe it's some of their, we're dispelling some myths. But what this does is this helps align the activities a little bit more. So I might have a couple learning objectives. It's going to be based on learning. And then from there, I could really start looking at what exercises I can pull together, which we'll see next. So here's some examples. So here's an example of a 60-minute training with 3 objectives and looking at imagery and routines. So participants they will walk away with developing their own pre-performance routine. I can see that because I've given them a template, and for the last 10 minutes of the session, they're going to create their own. And I can see how it went, give them some feedback. That's something I can see. That's something I can observe. So develop is basically an example of application. I'm going to create something. However, they can't do that unless they clearly define elements of effective imagery. So when you think about controllability, vividness, perspective, those three elements that we tend to talk a lot about, I might have to educate them on what that is first before we get to that pre-performance routine. So in this stage, this is that first level of learning, just knowledge and definitions and just memorizing this. So I know I have a clear grasp of what these things are before I go to trying applying it. Speaking of another example of application, another learning objective is identifying a specific situation that they might want to mentally rehearse. So when we look at these three things, in this case, they do complement each other, but they might be separate at times. But I thought I'd go with one with imagery, since that's a topic area we discuss quite a bit. So this is not in order, but if it were to go in order, we're going to clearly define the elements of effective imagery. 2, I'm going to have them identify specific situations. That way it's simple. We got to start with one thing before we can start applying it to more things. So let's identify a specific situation, and then let's create a routine for it. So in this case, I already gave it to you. One of the situations is pre-performance. So they're developing a pre-performance routine. But that's the example then of how to identify objectives, and they're described in a way where I can watch it happening right in front of me. So then that way, if I quiz them at the end and they can't clearly define it, then the learning objective wasn't met. So that's a way I can quality control what I'm doing. And that's outside of any type of assessment, so mindset assessment. We're just talking strictly from a learning perspective when it comes to developing a training. So here's some examples of logistics. I'll be brief on this one. Bottom line is just don't forget them. But time is one of the biggest ones. How much time do you have? Because time will dictate how many activities you can do. The setting, once again, how many participants? Is this a physical location? Because this helps me with the delivery method. If I have enough space, then maybe I can do a lot of small group activities. If I don't have a lot of space, then maybe I got to keep all these activities as one large group. It helps you with how you want to deliver and have them work through some of these activities. If you're on Zoom, we now have the capabilities to do breakout rooms, so then you can get creative with how you want to do that. And then, of course, with resources, not just with technology, but are you doing this by yourself? Especially as you get more experienced in your career, and you're getting a little bit more funding for your seminars. If you're doing something larger scale, then you're definitely going to be having other people helping you, facilitating around conversations, running different breakouts. So those are now new considerations that you'll need to keep in mind. Okay, so now to developing the plan, and there's 2 parts here. I'm going to come back to this introduction piece because this is really important. But let's just start with the easiest one first, and that is the activities. So now, based on the objectives, what exercise might be needed? And this starts with how do I want to run this? A lot of times when we're first kicking things off, we might open up with a popcorn activity for the large group, something like that. Maybe I'm asking a set of questions. Maybe I'm doing an experiential activity, but it might be big group to start before we start breaking things up. But it still starts with that objective. So once again, if I'm doing an imagery script, then what type of activity are we doing, right? Are they going to work on their own? Or are they going to work in partners? Those are some considerations as you're designing the exercise. This one, though, is what will elevate or deflate your whole activity. Really think about the questions here. How am I setting this up? How am I painting that context? What are the key takeaways that you want to summarize afterward? That is really, really important, and you'll get better at figuring out what types of questions you want to use to set up an exercise and debrief it. Transitions won't necessarily be as relevant in a micro lesson, but in general, how do you want to transition between the topics so it builds and it's not repetitive. One of the hardest things for newer instructors when you're running team sessions is redundancy. And just keeping in mind, okay, if this, the first one is to clearly identify, going back to that imagery. If we're going to talk about building, well, the first one is to clearly identify the fundamentals of imagery. Perspective, controllability. Okay, so that's exercise 1. Throw that stuff out. Then exercise 2, let's start identifying some of those key situations. So we're now building. And then now 3, let's put it all together. Let's go ahead and develop a routine as you're walking away. So you're transitioning a little bit more from topic to topic. So it builds instead of just kind of circles around, which is common. Okay, so now for coming back to the introduction. I break it in 3 things. I'm going to come back to when to introduce yourself in a second, but have a powerful hook 'em right off the bat. We know this, but I think we can be a little bit more creative in how we go about it. So when you're first walking out, you only have a minute to grab someone's attention. So what do you want to do? It's a thought-provoking short story. I love stories. Where I see it go south is people get too long-winded in their story. Give one, get in, get out. Make sure it's really clear. Powerful question, same thing. If you have a great question, that's just as good of a story. You're going to really get them thinking. Where that falls flat is if you just have a flat question. But I love a good question for opening up any type of training session. If you're thinking about it, if you're able to craft one that really gets them critically thinking. And of course, an experiential exercise. That's probably the most common in our field. But the whole point here is the hook 'em should only be there to set the tone for what to expect. I'll give an example of that with the focus one. But in the case of imagery, maybe you open it up with a very specific imagery script to get them thinking about things and the power of imagery to set the tone for how it can be used for the rest of the night. That'd be an example. But it's there to set the flow. Now, in terms of introducing yourself, this is personal preference. I've gotten to the point where I'd like to do a really powerful, or not powerful, but I like to do the hook 'em first. Let me just walk right in. I'll say thank you, thanks for being here, and get right into something. And then afterward, I summarize it and start stating the intent of the night, which is then gives me the opportunity to now introduce myself. So for example, stick with imagery since that's what we've been talking about so far. Maybe walk them through a real short imagery script, summarize, the points of it, and then my role. So I've been doing this for about 12 years now with certain populations. And one of the coolest things about it right now, I'm already going into my experience, and it flows a little bit more. It's not so clunky versus kind of everyone's excited to see you and it just falls flat right away. You should go right into your biography. So it's things to keep in mind. It is personal preference, does not matter. But that's one that I found that I've really liked is let's get their attention right away, get right into the intent, and then use that time to introduce myself, because then I can get them right back in and going into the first full exercise. In a micro lesson, it's much harder. You're probably not really going to get a chance to introduce yourself. So I would save that as its own topic or do it separate. Just so then that way, if you're trying to save some time, that's a good way to kind of move that forward. If you're doing micro lessons, you're probably doing it. You're not going to be doing them as one-offs. They're probably going to be with a group that you're working with, or maybe you're creating general content that's consumable to the masses. And so either way, if the masses are consuming it, they're already getting additional information on you. So you can just kind of get right to the point there. And to put this all together, here's an example of the flow. So I got a quick hook 'em, quickly summarize it and state the intent of the session, quick introduction of myself and my role here, and then transition right to the first full activity. That's if you're doing a more traditional one. If you're doing a micro lesson, you'll go from 1, 2 to 4. Just skip right in. Okay, so that's the quick overview of what this looks like for putting it all together. What I'm going to go ahead and do now is I will quickly go to touch base on evaluation and feedback. This is important, but in a micro lesson setting, it's going to look very different. So 2 things to keep in mind. If you're just delivering a training session, this is probably a couple of my favorite ones. Have somebody present back. Okay, now that we've went through this, maybe what's something you want to start doing a little bit more and continue doing, maybe stop doing. That's always a good one. And these are informal, by the way. These are more of what we call a formative or summative, assessments. And then what's one thing? What's one thing you're taking away from today that you're thinking about a little bit more? This is something you can just check in. It's self-reported, kind of keeps it fun, keeps it light, keeps it going. That's really good there. If you are using any mindset assessments, you can certainly still check in there. So maybe they're doing an assessment on the TASE, test of attentional and interpersonal styles, and where they're going there. So they've already taken that. And you're training in your micro training or your micro lessons just on one of the factors. Well, then you can still check in with that anyway. You can have them take it again right away after, see how they're progressing in that area. So you can do things like that. However, for these type of things, I'll just stick with this for right now, because if you are using assessments, that's going to be more personal to your approach in your consulting. Okay. So what I am going to do now is dive in to an example. So how do we put all this thing together? So this is kind of a pre-slide that I put together for this video. I can get this going here. But here's an example of objectives. So I'm doing a mock lesson here, micro lesson on attention and focus. So participants will understand 2 basic principles of our attention. That's one of the objectives. Participants will also identify 2 to 3 key situations where composure might be most critical for their performance. That's it. It's a short, concise micro lesson. So let's get started. So when it comes to attention and focus, what do we need to know? Here's what I'd like you to do. So we get started. All I want you to do is observe the image. That's it, just observe it. We're going to do this for 2 minutes, and all I want you to do is anytime your mind might wander or you get distracted, you got a thought coming up about something else, just make a note, but that's it. And then just bring your attention back to the target. Time is yours. Okay, time. So before we do anything else, how many of you noticed that your mind wandered once, twice, 3 times, over 5? Okay, so in that exercise, we're going to break roll for a second. The reason I like to ask that is our mind's always going to wander, right? So I like to get them right away. What was your experience? So after we start discussing that, Say, okay, our mind wandered. So what did you notice? Now we're back in roll here. So what did you notice while you're trying to observe that? What was that experience like for you? This is where some people might say things like, well, I started getting a little bored, or I felt distracted, or it was pretty easy. So based on their answers, I'll facilitate it from there. So if I'm summarizing this a little bit, so how many of you found it pretty easy to bring your attention back? Okay, yeah. Why do you think it was easy to bring it back? What did you notice? And we'll just continue that dialogue. But here's the point. Why am I asking you all this? Why do we go through this exercise? When it comes to our attention, our brain is designed to do two things. It is really good at focusing. It likes really clear targets, but it also wants to jump around. It's kind of like ADD. And this is all because of how we were hardwired way back in the day. I'm walking out of that cave, I better be able to pick up a target. But it also doesn't do me any good if I'm focused on one target and miss the other one. So because of how our brain's hardwired, it's not intended to sit still. But being aware of these two things, that it does like a specific target, it does like to focus, but it also wants to jump around, we can start training our attention both ways. Because the reality of our attention is, if we really want to strengthen our focus and be composed, it's about navigation, not just concentration. Staring at a grid all day long or a target, that might help you focus on one thing, but it's not helping you shift, because it's only a matter of time when your brain shifts. And without our ability to do that, we wouldn't be able to do complex tasks like sports. Because think about how many things you have to pay attention to when you're competing. And so being able to give our brain a really clear target, like focus over there, is good. But then we can also teach it to shift around to make sure we're not missing anything. And then that way, our ability to play a little faster, a little bit more precise, gets easier and easier the more we practice. And then distractions are just fleeting. They're really not going to take our attention away from things that matter. And so think about it in terms of navigation, not concentration. So as we get started, so we'll be diving into training both our ability to have clear targets, clear intentions, and also how to shift. So as we set the tone for that, as we wrap up tonight, identify 2 to 3 situations. What are 2 to 3 situations for you that are non-negotiable? I mean, vital, like I gotta be locked in. What are those? And if you only have one, that's fine. But let's shoot for 2 to 3 really important situations, because that's what we'll build around as we're getting more comfortable with this training. Time is yours. Okay, so we'll speed up through that part. You can see where I'm going with it. Okay, so now here's the summary. Our brain is not designed to just focus. It likes both clear targets, and it has to shift its attention around. So once again, the big theme for tonight as we're going into this attention training is navigation versus pure concentration. It's all about navigating. Do I know where I want it? And then can I shift it when I need it? Where I want it, shift it when I need it. And that's the 2 principles we'll be building as we go forward. Okay, so that one actually was pretty brief. I think that was about 8 minutes, but you can see how quick it's really got to be in a micro lesson. So that one was just an introduction. Once again, the 2 objectives, individuals will understand 2 key principles around our attention, and they're going to start identifying 2 to 3 situations that they really want to maintain their composure in while they're competing. But that's it in a nutshell. When it comes to creating content, always starts with the objective. I'm going to go ahead and pull the screen back up here. State the objective, be really clear. Keep in mind the logistics and the needs. That's going to make developing the plan a lot easier. What's the objective? Then what are the exercises? And pinging between both of them is how I want to evaluate. What are the things that I can observe, that I can see, to know that my goals are met when I'm delivering the training? Thanks.